Greetings, fellow Mist Wanderers. My name is Steve Morgan, and this is DM of the Mists, covering all things Curse of Strahd and Ravenloft. It's a very dreary day outside today in Wales, where I live, so the lighting's a bit weird. Hopefully, it feels very sort of good mood-wise to be talking about a Domain of Dread and an element of Ravenloft. It's such miserable weather. Okay, so this is a Ravenloft video where I talk about how I ran a certain Domain of Dread in my ongoing 5th edition Ravenloft campaign. I have covered a bunch of other domains before. Let's see if I remember them all off the top of my head. Volkovnia, the Carnival, Valachan, the Sea of Sorrows, Markovia. I feel like there's one or two more I've forgotten. Yeah, currently running Forlorn. As I record this, they've just entered Castle Tristenoira, if that's how that's pronounced, which is kind of like the second half of the domain. And I wanted to do this video in two parts because I think we're going to be in the castle for a while, and finishing up the domain will take a while. We've just done all of the pre-castle stuff that's fresh in my mind, fresh in my memory, and so this is going to be a two-parter. The first part being everything up to the castle. Part two will be just Castle Tristenoira. I want to give my usual disclaimer. This is kind of like an ideas dump. It's not this is an adventure you run from start to finish. If you're thinking of running Forlorn as part of your Ravenloft campaign or doing it as a one-shot, hopefully some of the stuff I say is useful. A few other disclaimers I should say specific to this one. Although I borrowed a lot from old editions, or second edition I think it was, I did use a homebrew map that somebody made, which I thought was cool, and that's got a few places on it outside of the castle where I kind of had to figure stuff out and put stuff there. And so I kind of did a semi-homebrew approach to the domain and didn't necessarily use everything that's in Castles Forlorn, which is the second edition module. And I made an accidental change to the goblins, which I'll talk more about later. I changed kind of the setup and how they arrived into the domain and stuff like that. So please be aware of all that. If you're expecting something that's literally straight out of Castles Forlorn, you might be a little disappointed. At least for the first half of the campaign. For this entire video, it'll be a lot of stuff that's inspired by Castles Forlorn. And don't worry, I definitely used Aggie and heard ApKie. He's a great NPC, with the intelligent goblin, air quotes. So obviously I used elements and still used Castles Forlorn for inspiration and flavour, but it's, you know, I did make changes, so please be aware of that. The lore in Van Richten's guide, 5th edition, is very brief. I'm going to get it up on this screen over here, actually. It's one of the minor domains. I'm looking over here at this screen, by the way, in case you see my face facing this way. It's one of the minor domains in Van Richten's guide, so the domains that literally only have like a paragraph each. And a lot of it still mirrors the original lore. I think a few differences they made are that he's a Dhampir by day rather than a vampire, spelt slightly differently. That means it's not a proper vampire, it's a vampire who can like go out in daytime and sunlight. Dhampir are like sort of half vampire or born from vampire. I can't remember the exact thing, but they're in Van Richten's guide. It's a lineage. Yeah, it actually says here half vampire. Tristan is a half vampire by day, ghost by night. And it's some interesting details they added. So they say he is a invention-obsessed Dhampir, and that his smoking fortress his goblin servants built. So, and I remember there was a Reddit thread talking about all this, and it sounds as though they're kind of pushing him in the direction more as a artificer, and that there's some other stuff going on in the castle that's, because I don't think in the original Castles Forlorn it talks about it being a smoking castle. It does talk about how the goblins built parts of it. So then I think there was a discussion about how maybe you could do like a Howl's Moving Castle thing, where instead of the sort of the unique element of Castle Tristenoira being that it lives in multiple time periods in the original lore, but maybe it's a castle that moves around. And I decided for the castle to run the castle. I pretty much run straight out of Castles Forlorn, so I did the whole 3 time periods thing. But it's kind of interesting, and I am thinking of giving Tristan maybe some artificer abilities and spells. And I like the idea as well that maybe he creates the goblins somewhere in the castle, and there's like a cavern under in the subterranean levels, like below the dungeons I think it is, or alongside the dungeons, where there's like, I think a pool of water. And I like the idea of like goblins, maybe a goblin once a day is created there. So it doesn't sound like a lot, that's still 365 goblins a year. And how long has the domain been around? Centuries. That's why there's thousands of goblins in the domain, even when some get killed or whatever. And he creates them, sort of like, reminds me of Saruman creating the Uruk-hai in Lord of the Rings. And even when I started running the domain, I was rewatching Netflix Castlevania. It kind of reminds me of what are they called? Forge Masters? The Forge Masters who can like create monsters from, well, in that case it's from, I think, from dead people, but in this case I was just like the idea of just like these goblins kind of rise up kind of thing. And I suppose now would be a good time to talk about what lore and resources I used, because I mostly borrowed from old lore. So Mrpedia is a godsend, as always. It's a Fraternity of Shadows wiki. Ravenloft wiki gives a lot of information about domains, Dark Lords, NPCs, locations, etc. for the domains from the older editions. The biggest help I had was Castles Forlorn, the original module. Like I said, I run the castle pretty much straight out of the book. I didn't necessarily run all of the pre-castle locations similar to the book, but took inspiration. For instance, I used Aggie, I used ApKie. I'll cover more of that later. In order to help with the conversion side of things, because I run a 5th edition game and Castles Forlorn is a 2nd edition module, I used this conversion guide, the Gothic Conversion. I believe his name is Igor. If you've spent any time on the Ravenloft subreddit, you've probably seen him advertise these before, and he mentions he does a post when he releases a new one, and sometimes there's sales on where you can get them in bundles quite at a discount. It was good, especially for the castle, adapting the treasure and magic items into 5e equivalents, the monsters and stat blocks. There's stat blocks, most of them based on the ghost stat block, but amended for a lot of the ghosts in the castle. There's a stat block for Aggie, there's a stat block for zombie wolves, and things like that. So I borrowed a lot from that, and that was very helpful. There's also a fan-made adventure called Standing Forlorn, which is interesting. Let's put it like that. I got it for a few reasons. So I should mention first of all that it predates Van Richten's guide. So I think the person created it not knowing if Forlorn was going to be carried on in 5th edition in D&D and what the plans were that Wizards of the Coast had. And I think there's an intro section that explains that it sort of heavily borrows from Castles Forlorn, but he kind of did his own thing with it. For example, the Dark Lord I don't think is Tristan. The Dark Lord is I think it's called Gwydion, which I love because I'm Welsh and that sounds very Welsh and probably like a creature from like Welsh mythology. But yeah, it's similar and different. And one of the reasons I got it was because it's intended for tier 4 play. And my characters at the moment my players' characters are level 14, 15, and it's intended for level 16 to 20. So I was kind of curious to know what monsters were suggested, and obviously it's a bit higher level than what my players are, but still very useful and handy looking at that and thinking, oh right, I'll include these monsters for some stuff and maybe tone it down a little bit, but not much. And it's easier doing that than, say, the Gothic Conversion, I think was intended for like levels 4 to 6, and my players are way above that. And, I added more monsters to the castle to sort of compensate with that, to balance that out, and I'll talk more about that in the part 2 video. There's also, I believe, a brief mention of Forlorn in Strahd, The War Against Ceithlenn. So this is the 2nd Strahd novel. It's been a while since I read it or listened to it. I got the audiobook, but I believe Strahd at one point, spoiler alert, Strahd at one point goes to like the domain's border and he sees the goblins in Forlorn. I think Forlorn just like appears and he's like, oh, what's this place? And he sees some goblins. So you might want to reread parts of that for inspiration and flavour of what the domain is like, what the goblins are like. I didn't reread it ahead of running Forlorn, and in fact I completely forgotten about it until I was preparing this video that, oh yeah, Forlorn appears in that novel, but feel free to take a look. So for the map, I used this fan-made map, which I thought was really cool. It's got some additional locations on it that aren't in Castles Forlorn or any of the older lore. I have a feeling that the person who created it for their own campaign and added to it based on their own game. Unfortunately, the person deleted their account, or maybe they got deleted from Reddit, I'm not sure. And it's not the highest quality version either, and I did a reverse image search to see if it's been posted anywhere else, but as far as I know, that's the only place it's been posted, and I don't know who created the map, so I can't go to them and say, what kind of stuff did you do in this place and this place? So I kind of had this map, and then I was like, right, I've got to figure out what to put in these additional locations. So I did a post on the Ravenloft subreddit and had some fantastic suggestions of what to put in some of the other locations, and I ended up borrowing a lot from that and using a lot of what was suggested, so that was good. I'll do a thing where I put a link in the description so you can see. Obviously I'm going to be talking a lot in this video about what I did, but in case there's things I didn't use and you want to do some further reading. In terms of random encounters, I'll talk about what I used as I went along. there were obviously goblins. Instead of using the stat block from the conversion guide or anywhere else, I just used the goblin boss stat block from, I want to say, the monster manual. So it's like a tougher goblin variant, so tougher than your 7 HP or whatever they are, standard goblins that people fight when they're like level 1 or 2. These are do more attacks, and yeah, I just like the stat block and like the idea that they have these scimitars and javelins that they use when attacking. Wargs, which I think goblins ride on, and I think are kind of mentioned in the old domain anyway, and I think Tristan can shape change into a warg, if I remember correctly. I'll talk more about that in the second video, and then I'll know for sure. The zombie wolves, which are unique, I want to say. Well, probably not unique, they probably appear in other places, but they are a unique monster, and I've never come across them before. They are obviously like wolves, but they have more HP and have the ability that zombies have, where there's the con save to see whether they are defeated properly or they just keep coming back. I did actually plan a random encounter and then forgot my players could bypass it by using the spell teleport, and I was like, dang. So I might do that. I might still use it so that my prep doesn't go to waste on their trips back and forth the castle, from the castle to their base, which I'll talk more about later, and so it doesn't go into waste entirely. I think I read somewhere that Aleps are a monster that can appear as a random encounter, and Aleps have a stat block in terms of 5th edition. Aleps appear in Mordenkainen's Tome of Foes, updated in Monsters of the Multiverse. They're pretty cool monsters to run. It was my first time running them as well, although I didn't run them as a random encounter, I ran them in one of the locations. I'll get to that later. Evil plants are a good idea. Things like shambling mounds, assassin vines, stuff like that, or stuff like that is cool, where they're walking through the forest and no, evil plants. In terms of music, I borrow a lot from tabletop audio, and there's things like, I think there was a song called Blighted Forest I used the world map. I haven't got a list ready in preparation for this video, but what I'll do is I will put them all in the description, what I used, where I used them. I'm sure I've got a list written somewhere rather than talk through it in this video. And what I'll do as well is I'll play some of the music as I go through this video. So if you like, oh, I like this tune when I'm playing a certain thing, that's probably what I played when I ran that location or that dungeon, for example. The hook I used was a bit of a funny one, and it was very specific to my game. So one of my players has a Air Genasi Paladin as their character. They joined mid Curse of Strahd, and they didn't have anywhere set in mind where they wanted to be from. So I said, do you like the idea of being from Forfarmax, where you're a Talon knight who's fought zombies, you know, on a monthly basis for years? And he's like, and the player was like, hey, that sounds really cool. And another detail from their backstory is that they had a adopted daughter, and two very interesting things that the player mentioned that probably, I assume, not knowing about Ravenloft lore, it's just a sort of happy coincidence, was that she had red hair and she had latent magical abilities. And I remember, this is a very long time ago, I think I put on the Ravenloft subreddit, hey, what can I do with this? And people were like, red-headed witch / druid from Forlorn. Perfect. So I always had it that if they went down this rabbit hole any further, they would find out that she was originally from Forlorn. The idea being that she somehow got escaped or got pushed through the mists from Forlorn to Forfarmax. That's where the PC found her, looked after her, and then when he later got pushed out of Forfarmax into Barovia and joined the rest of my player characters, defeated Strahd, and later they went back to Forfarmax, and there's the whole How I Ran Forfarmax video. But yeah, that's essentially how she ended up under his guardianship and parenting. How they connected the dots between her being Forlorn was through Esmeralda. So Esmeralda, the NPC from Curse of Strahd, after they defeated Strahd and can leave Barovia, she meets the adopted daughter and straight away takes the players aside and says, I think she's from Forlorn. I don't know much about Forlorn. Van Richten has done some research, but I understand it's this domain that's small, and there's druids and there's goblins, and about the redheads with the magical abilities. So that was their thinking then, that right, okay, so there's this place called Forlorn we need to get to if we want to dig into this more. So after doing a whole bunch of other domains, they said, we want to go to Forlorn. And they had their Mist Talisman, and they headed to Forlorn. Now their arrival into Forlorn was very specific as well. So I previously run the Sea of Sorrows, and when they defeated Pietra van Ries, they took her ship, the Relentless. And at that point in the campaign, we'd done a lot of travel through the mists, and I gave the ship quite a few quirks, one of which is that it doesn't have to travel between two domains that need to have a sea. It can teleport into a domain that, so long as it has a body of water big enough to fit a ship, it can go there. So it could teleport into landlocked domains such as Barovia, and it could land on Lake Zarovich.
it could go to Forlorn and appear at the lake. I can't remember the name of it, but the lake just outside Lakar. Forlorn is also a landlocked domain. And Forlorn is a landlocked domain as well, and it has a big lake called the Lake of Red Tears. So they arrived, rather than arriving through the border, they arrived on the Lake of Dead Tears through this magical ghost ship, and they were like, right, disembark and have a wander around. And straight away they saw this ruined forest, but it looked like it'd been burnt to the ground, and they encountered this group of goblins, and they're unsure about these goblins, so they hide from them. So at this point, I should tell you that the change I made to the goblins, it was an accidental change, and then I ran with it. And if anything, ironically, I think it makes the goblins scarier, is I thought the goblins couldn't talk. And I think later on this makes ApKie very impactful as a character, because he's the one goblin that can talk. And then I realised I'd gone with it, and I realised, according to Castle's Forlorn, the goblins can talk. I think there's a moment in the castle where one of them can shout something. I was like, oh no. But then I was like, actually, I really like this idea. And it kind of makes them more scary and more terrifying, that they're kind of zombie-like in that they kind of shamble around, well, not shamble around, they kind of move around and under somebody's control. And then the idea then that if they see the PCs, they kind of go like running up to them with these scimitars and stuff. I don't know. And I had it, they were going to target any druidic looking players and any redhead players. And funny enough, they've got Jennifer Weathermay Foxgrove as an NPC ally, and she's a druid, or at least she is in 5th edition. And one of the characters, she's not a druid, or well, there's a whole thing about that. I'm going to do the whole death of an ancestor thing at one of the events from Castle's Forlorn, and she's going to find out she has an ancestor from Forlorn, but she is a rogue, but she's got red hair. So I was thinking that those two characters would be targeted from the goblins more than other people, and that's going to be kind of scary for them, I guess. So anyway, sorry, I'm digressing, going off point, but they're kind of hiding through this sort of burnt wood forest, and they see these goblins that look like they're controlling and looking for someone. And then they see this hooded figure, also a similar size to the goblins, who is following the goblins as if sort of scoping them out. And this hooded figure sees the PCs and signals to them as if to say, I'm not going to do you any harm. And she removes her hood, and she's a regular goblin. So goblin with an eye. So imagine like a goblin from the Sword Coast or wherever, you know, if someone created a PC that was a goblin race, and not the special Forlorn goblins with a Y. And she could talk, and she explained that she was from another world and ended up getting stuck in Forlorn. There's a small group of surviving druids elsewhere in the domain. Come to safety, follow me. Come with me if you want to live, or whatever that saying is. Is that from Terminator? I think so. And okay, so this is another change I made. In Castle's Forlorn, I think the characters are essentially just dumped in Forlorn. It's like, right, what do you want to do? Where do you want to go? And they give them very little direction. What I wanted to do was I wanted them to meet the druids almost straight away and learn about the land, learn about different places they can go. Maybe it's a bit hand-holdy. Tell me in the comments if you think I'm being a bit too, hand-holdy with my players. But there's two main reasons I did this. One, otherwise it feels very directionless, which I guess that can happen in D&D, and you're supposed to arrive at this domain and not know where you are and where to go and stuff. But I kind of like the idea that they meet the druids early on, the druids give them a few side quests, and they kind of have a bit of direction. There might be DMs who disagree with that. I think I read in a review for Castle's Forlorn that one of the criticisms with it's kind of doesn't give much direction early on. And, so maybe I actually did a better thing there. You tell me. Another thing is the castle. I didn't have the castle ready. I didn't want to say, you're right, what do you do? And they go, oh, there's a castle over there, I want to go to that castle. And I'd be like, oh my God, I haven't got prepared. So the castle was kind of like, by finding the druids early on, the druids would say, you should go to this tower and this temple and this place. And then the castle would be a later place they go to, and that would give me a lot more time to prepare the castle. And that was another reason I did that. Because if they said straight away, we want to go to that castle, I'd be like, guys, I need a 3-month break in order to get the castle ready, because the castle is a beast. And as I'll talk more about in the second video. So this goblin takes them to Sanctuary. And a slight difference I made, instead of there being multiple sanctuaries, like there is in Castle's Forlorn, I had it that there was one sanctuary, and it's the mines. The mines in Castle's Forlorn, I think, are kind of like a sacred place for the goblins. But I like the idea that the druids like being outside, they like nature, and they're forced to live and survive in this place that's very sort of not very druid friendly. It's, manufacturing, mining metal and things like that. And they have no choice but to live in these mines, otherwise goblins would kill them all. However, the mines lead out to various places, and there's 4 tunnels The one goes northwest, one goes northeast, one goes southwest, one goes southeast, that lead to like the different locations a little bit quicker. And so the mine is connected to these different tunnels. So I kind of still borrowed the sort of tunnels element from Castles Forlorn. It's a good way to get around the domain, and it sort of avoids overland travel where we might have lots of random encounters with lots of wandering goblins. I used this map, I think it's from Morvold Press, for the mines. It's a bit of a beast, a bit of a big map. And I had it that when they arrived, you'll see on the map, in the sort of northwest is the entrance, the tunnel, that it was actually disguised. And the goblin they were with, the good goblin with an eye, did some sort of magical or druidic thing that opened it up. And then they could go in and it would seal behind them. And then in there they found a few dozen survivors, mostly druids, but also other forlorn survivors who are, forlorn natives who aren't druids, and also just people who'd stumbled in from the mists and were trapped in Forlorn. The leader of the druids was Sheila, so I didn't do the whole thing about there being two factions. I had it there was this one group of survivors, but used the name Sheila from Castles Forlorn. There were two priests there, both of whom who could create food and water. That's how they could live and survive. And one of them was called Seamus, and he was the father of the PC's adoptive daughter. And when the PCs arrived and they name dropped the adopted daughter, Sheila and Seamus freak out and they're like, how do you know that name? How do you know about her? And they reveal that Seamus is the father and Sheila's the grandmother. And what happened was Sheila's daughter and Seamus's wife, Fiona, with two N's, I think I borrowed that name from Castles Forlorn as well. The adopted daughter escaped the mine, wanted to see what was out there. She's only like 5 or 6 years old, if I remember correctly. And Fiona went to look for her and the two of them never came back. And they were both suspected dead or captured, probably dead. But now that the adopted daughter has been found and explained that she somehow escaped the mists and ended up in Forlorn, they're wondering if maybe the Fiona is alive out there somewhere. So very relieved and happy to see that the adopted daughter has been looked after by this PC and the adventurers, and now she lives. After liberating Forlorn, they've got a base in Barovia, they took her there. I also still used Madame Ursula and Peter spelled with an A, Peter, from Castles Forlorn, but they were already at the mine. Madame Ursula, if it ever came up, was going to be the diviner stat block, and Peter was a bandit captain. And I'll talk about it in a minute. Madame Ursula gives a card reading that helps give some direction. I got the idea from the Gothic Conversion of Castles Forlorn, and then kind of tweaked it to my own needs. I also wanted to include a Turtle Druid because there's a dedicated Turtle Druid stat block somewhere. I don't know if it's Monster Manual or something else. There aren't many Druid stat blocks, and to say there's a Turtle Druid, I was like, well, I gotta have a Turtle Druid in my campaign, in this domain. And I had it that this turtle had been captured but escaped in the dungeons in Castle Tristenoira. He hid in a shell, so the goblins just assumed he died and threw the shell out, and then he escaped from there. So he was able to give a tiny bit of information based on his very limited understanding of the castle, that there were lots of goblins, and that they could see some sort of hovering creatures that could float around and go through walls, and these are obviously the ghosts. They were given a bunch of quests, and I essentially just looked at the map and said, right, there's this issue with this tower, there's a temple, so on and so on. Because Jennifer Weathermace Foxgrove was with them and she's a druid, she's got an interest in druid circles. And I did this thing where the stat block I used for Jennifer, I didn't use the druid stat block. I used an NPC from either an adventurer setting, I'm not too sure. And she could only world shape into like 1 or 2 things. And I like the idea that as she explores the domains of Dread with the characters, she can learn more wild shape abilities by going to different druid circles. And the druids there, Sheila and co, said, well, there's 2 that we know of in Forlorn. One of them is at the Temple of the Horn God, and one of them is Ceithlenn's Tower. So they knew of 2 places they wanted to go to where Jennifer could learn more druidic powers. Madame Ursula beckons them over and says, I sense you have a Tarokka deck on you. They have the Lubus Tarokka of Souls magic item. And she said, I can do you 2 readings, or 1 reading split into 2 parts. And the reason I did this is because there's a card reading in the Gothic Conversion that points the players to 5 different things. Where Tristan is in Castle Tristenoira, where the sword that killed his son Morholt is, the letter between, I believe it's Rivelin and Flora, Tristan's parents, the love letter, the Horn of the Sacred Grove, and the Fated Ally. Now, because I hadn't got all the castle stuff ready, I just did the ally and the horn as a sort of first part, because I didn't have the rooms. At that point, I didn't know what I was doing with the castle. I didn't know if I was going to use the castle maps. I was going to adapt it. I was thinking of using, oh, let me use a fan-made castle map that isn't Castle Tristenoira and just say, use elements of it. So I didn't want to like use the information and say, oh, it's in this study or it's in the library or something like that if I used the castle map that didn't have a study or a library. So I said, she's a tired old woman. I can't remember what voice I gave her, just an old gruff voice. I'm a tired old woman. Let me do this card reading in 2 parts. And so she just did the 2 cards, the ally and the horn. And I reworked the locations as well. I loved the idea of the Tarokka reading in that resource. But the way it's done is you draw, say, the stars cards, and cards 1 to 2 are one location, cards 3 to 4 are another location, so on. But what that means is you could draw the druid card, and it doesn't really match with what the meaning of the place is. So I kind of tweaked it to be that the horn could be different places based on what the card actually is. I didn't do all 40 cards. I probably just did like a selection of 10 or 20. And same with the ally as well. I tweaked the allies to be people who they knew. So one of the ally choices could be the goblin who took them to the sanctuary in the first place. It could be the tortle druid. It could be the priest who I introduced. Oh, the priest, by the way, the adopted father was from the Sword Coast originally, so he wasn't a Forlorn native. He was someone who arrived out of Forlorn. And because only 2 of my players could make it out of 3, I actually recorded the card reading. And so I'll show that to you now. We'll blur out 2 of my players live together. So they had one of the 3 screens. And then one screen was me, and one screen was, I had I used a mic stand, put one of those, like you get like ring lights that have the things that like a phone attachment where you can hold a phone on it, and just had it pointing directly down to a table. So you'll see that the other camera is me doing the card reading. In her deep voice, she says, I'm a tired old woman. I can only do 2 cards for you. I'll do the other 3 cards at a later date. So she will say, this first card is the artifact. This card determines the location of the horn of the sacred grove. And you see Sheila, who's over here in this conversation, be like, what? As in, like, that's really important. That sounds really important. You will see as I shuffle these cards that the cards will decide your fates. Basically, I'm not rigging it. This is purely random. And then I'll put both cards down for now. And then I've got a table. So this is the location of what she said was called the Horn of the Sacred Grove. Conjurer. In the tunnels below the smoking mountain, in a place where death lurks, the prize waits, protected by bones. Later on, I'll do my usual thing of I'll put this in the write-up and I'll put it in thingy. And then, oh, my mouse there. Move out of the way. She says, bouncing back to another document, this second card, the Raven. This card sheds light on one who will help you greatly in the battle against darkness. And the card is Philanthropist. I can't remember what this one is. Oh! It's like a 1 in 30 chance of this happening. A son, a husband, a father, a priest. He will leave these mines and travel with you through these lands. And Seamus looks at you a bit sort of panicky and alarmed. And she also looks as if a bit worried by this revelation. And Peter, the grandson, will say, Grandmama Ursula, are you sure this reading is correct? And she says, the cards do not lie. This is Seamus's fate. I think I screwed up at one of the parts. Instead of reading the text that is kind of more fanciful and more sort of flavour for the horn, I read the bit that said, this guides the players to the Horn of the Sacred Grove, and accidentally said Horn of the Sacred Grove. So I had to improvise then and say, Sheila was like, what? Did you say the Horn of the Sacred Grove? Oh my God. We're looking for that. We've been after that for a long time. They also received a letter from a character who gave them a second Tarokka reading. I've mentioned this in other videos, where when we started our domain hopping campaign after Curse of Strahd, they had a second Tarokka reading that led them to magic items and an ally spread throughout all the domains of dread, and it led them to the Sea of Sorrows, Mordant, the Carnival. And I had a PC return in Valacham, which is the domain, or a player return in Valacham, which is the domain we did before Forlorn. And I realised that my two other players had magic items especially for them. The paladin got a Vorpal sword, the wizard got a staff of the magi, and I didn't have anything for my rejoining rogue. She had to quit the campaign towards the end of Curse of Strahd. I had to run her PC as a DM PC for the end, and then because we changed what was going on, I just said, oh, she's been written out of the campaign now, she's gone back home, or she's doing other stuff in the Domains of Dread. Anyway, she rejoins them and we figured out what happened, and she spent some time in Cartacus, which is another cool way to introduce another potential Domain of Dread they might go to at some point. But I didn't want her missing out, so I said this letter from this second Tarokka reading giver who is actually Hiscosa in disguise. It's a long story. There's more information about it in the DM's Guild resource I put out called the second Tarokka reading, where I kind of, after I did it in my game, turned it into a DM's Guild resource so that other DMs could do it. And she was going to find a Ring of Invisibility. And hilariously, the place I drew for the Ring of Invisibility was the same place where the Horn of Sacred Grove was, and it was literally the first stop they were going to go to. It was this blocked tunnel, this cave they were going to go to. Before they set off to do the quests, they spent some time with the druids. I think they had a long rest, and the druids told them a bit about the domain, and I used the What the Druids Know information from Castles Forlorn, and they kind of tell this tragic story about the land and the castle that got built, and the Bard at Blank, and the Mark at Blank in his war against the clans, and him sort of reclaiming Forlorn, or Forfar as it was known back then, and then the Time of Terrors, and then everyone becoming turned into the goblyns and things like that. They then have their first quest where they're told that because they want to go to the Temple of the Horn God first, which is in the northwest, but I said the tunnel was blocked. A monster hunter and adventurer previously went but never came back, so they suspect she got killed. And what happened is, when they get there, they see her as a stone statue, so she got petrified. And I used this map from Dice Grimorium of a sort of some underground tunnels. I used an emptier variant, so there's no boxes and stuff, it's mostly just bare tunnels. And in one of the rooms is a stone statue and a pile of bones, and the pile of bones form to become a dragon bone golem. There's a bone golem in 2nd edition Castles Forlorn, but there's also a dragon bone golem in the 5th edition Fizban's Treasury of Dragons book, and I like the idea of using the dragon bone in place of the bone golem. So I used a dragon bone golem, and then I found these cool little constructs called skull flyers. I think they're from a module called Stormlord's Wrath. I think it's a like mini sequel following Dragon of Icespire Peak. And my my wizard slash cleric got really annoyed because he tried using turn undead on them, and they're technically constructs, not undead, and same with the dragon bone golems. Got really annoyed that these creatures made out of bones were completely immune to that. But hey, it was what it was, and I don't think the player held it against me too long. And then they addressed this stone statue, which looks like a young woman, slightly fanged teeth. She's armed to the teeth with things like a longsword, crossbow, wooden stakes. And instead of saying, oh, they had to get greater restoration, I said that when they defeated the Dragonbone Golem, the petrification effect was released, and suddenly she's like, whoa, oh my gosh, where am I? And months had passed, she'd been a stone statue, and she introduced herself as Savra. Now, for people who know 5th edition lore, this is Savra Sunstar, daughter of Jander Sunstar. Now, my players had previously met Jander Sunstar in Demonlieu, and I talk more about that in my Demonlieu video, and I also did a dedicated Jander Sunstar video, because I love the character of Jander. Talk more about him there. And in 5th edition, Savra is Jander's Dampier daughter. It was funny, because she introduced herself as Savra, not Savra Sunstar. And my players are completely none the wiser about her connection to him. And she talked about how she was hunting a vampire and then got accidentally stuck in Forlorn, but they never asked her about it and she never said. And if sort of pressed on it, she would say she was hunting Jander. And then my players probably would have been like, oh, we know Jander, he's cool, he's fine, because I think they've got on really well with him, and they know he's a good vampire, and he helped them alongside Alanic Ray, Arthur Sedgwick in Demonlieu to take down another vampire. And that would have been quite interesting, I think. And Savra's still around as I record this, so if they go back and talk to her, this could still come up. I didn't use the artwork for the book. There's some cool artwork. If you Google her name and go to Google image search, you will find it no problem. It's somebody's art on Twitter. I don't like sharing people's fan art unless they make it very clear they're happy for people to use it credited or things like that. So I'll just tell you how to find it. I'm not going to show it here, but some very cool artwork someone did of Savra. That was the artwork I used. Savra then, as a thank you, said, well, I'll go with you to this Temple of the Horn God to help you out before heading back to the mine, and then probably stay there. So they then went to the Temple of the Horned God. This was an interesting one. I really struggled to find a dungeon or a temple map that had like standing stones or druid stones. They were either really small, or they were outdoors, or they were just general standard sort of castles or ruins or temples or dungeons. So I ended up doing something a bit unorthodox. So firstly, I was looking for a temple entrance. So I planned to use a map for the outside and then a different map for the inside. And I came across a map where I think one of the variants is it's essentially a hole in the ground. The way into the dungeon is a hole. And then I was like, oh my God, what about an underground dungeon? And the way in is down this hole. I thought that could be a really cool idea. And then because I couldn't find a map of an underground dungeon, I made one myself, and I landed on this idea of what if the entire dungeon, instead of being a dungeon that has a druid stone circle, what if the entire dungeon is a giant stone circle? So there's one chamber in the middle, which is bigger, and then 8 points, sort of north, northeast, east, southeast, and so on, where each of them has a small standing stone that needs to be awakened in order to then attune to or activate the druid stone in the middle. So I made it myself using Dungeon Draft. Disclaimer I've said multiple times, because I've made things like Castle Tristenoira in Valachan and a few other maps for other purposes. I am not a dedicated map maker. I know the basics. I know enough to make a, okay-ish looking map. So please go easy on me if you look at it and say, oh, the shadows are wrong, or it looks a bit like empty or boring. And I tried to do it so that it wasn't a case of a central chamber and, spokes, if you will, or tunnels that go to each thing. That you'll see that there's elements where it branches off to 2 directions, or the sort of northeast, you've got to go like a really roundabout sort of coiling tunnel kind of way. In order to get to the east one, you've got to go north and then around. Stuff like that, really. It was quite fun creating that and thinking of what monsters could go in there and thinking about what challenges there could be. For example, one of the stones is damaged, so how do they fix it? Do they repair it? Things like that. And I had fun coming up with more monsters to put in here, and some of them I would probably say are not very Ravenloft friendly, but I wanted to include them anyway. See what you think. So there were Aleps, which I think kind of fit with Forlorn anyway, and they were like, there was 3 of them hovering around like one of the stones. I had a sleeping behir. Behirs are like really tough. I think that's how it's pronounced. Hold on. There's a thingy, isn't there? They do on D&D Beyond, they do the pronunciations.
Behir.
Behir! That was really loud, sorry. Behir is how it's pronounced. So Behirs are in the monster manual, and they didn't wake it up in the end. They were very quiet and sneaky and stealthy, and that was fine. I gave them a snuggle little panic where I said at one point, when Jennifer, the druid who was with them, was attuning to the stone, he did the thing. The thing was snoring, and then just did the thing where it goes, and then just silence, and then carries on snoring. To just give that little panic of, oh no, they were nearly woke it up. I did a cloaker. That's from the monster manual as well. That was in one of the tunnels. Earth Elemental Myrmidons, they're from Mordenkainen's Tome of Foes, Monsters of the Multiverse. They appeared in the central chamber after all the stones got awakened, and that was probably one of the most challenging battles. I think Savra, who went with them, got KO'd, even though she's got like 90 HP in the stat block I used for her. Gorth, which is this kind of weird sort of beholder creature. What's the lore there? I'm going to try and remind myself. It's when a ritual to summon a spectator goes wrong, a Gorth may then appear. So they're freaky little beholder type dudes. And there was a small bit of comic relief introducing him as well, which I'll get to in a minute. I had a green slard, because they look quite druidic. I thought that'd be quite a cool thing to add. They previously encountered a death slard in the Amber Temple in Barovia, so they knew what slards were like. A green slard is a bit weaker, but it was quite funny. It disguised itself as a druid that just couldn't talk the whole time. They either speak telepathically or they can only speak slard. I added some trappers in one of the tunnel. They are like, how do you describe a trapper? They look like shadowy kind of creatures or like manta ray style creatures that go on a ceiling and then like drop down and try and smother people. Yeah, manta-like creature, subterranean environments, stuff like that. I used violet fungus. So you'll see on the map I used that one of the stones is surrounded by these purple mushrooms, and I used violet fungus for those. I think that was everything. And as they went through, they defeated the trappers, the violet fungus, they fixed the broken monolith. They did that in the end because they've got marvelous pigments, I think they're called. So they essentially painted the rest of the monolith, and I said, okay, job done. But they had a few potential other options they could have done. They didn't wake up the sleeping Behir. I've already forgotten how it's pronounced. Behir. And then the Gorth. So the green slard, they saw the green slard and it just started to follow them. And they like left it to its own devices, and they were like, okay, you seem friendly and we won't hurt you, so we'll leave you to do whatever it is you're doing. And then it just followed them. Then they encountered the Gorth, And I said, as they encountered the Goth, they could hear it speak. One of them could speak one of its languages. I said it was speaking one of its languages, and it was saying something about the magic tasty stone. It was like, oh, magic tasty stone, no, oh, delicious magic tasty stone. I need to sustain myself on the magic tasty stone, but I can't eat the whole magic tasty stone, or else I will, go hungry. And so basically this Goth had arrived there, gotten crazy, gotten stuck here, and was sustaining itself by trying to nibble on this magical stone. And players approached it, managed to convince it that they were going to do this thing to make it even more magical. So they avoided a battle with it, and then when Jennifer awakened it, it was like, oh, it's even more magical now, thank you. And then the green slad, disguised as a druid, also made themselves invisible. One of my PCs had to see invisibility, could see that the druid was following them, and invisible, and like, this is dodgy. And then there was a battle, and even the Goth helped them out. I think it used 2 of its I-beams on the green slad, and then they defeated the green slad. So that was quite cool and quite interesting. So they not only didn't fight the Goth, but the Goth, I'm assuming that's how it's pronounced. I should have looked this up earlier. Gauth. I've been saying it wrong. Thank you, Matt Mercer. Gauth. It's so fun running fantasy style things where there's a million ways you can pronounce almost every single character name or location name or whatever, or monster name. So yeah, this Gauth helped them in the battle, and that was pretty cool. They went to the middle and fought the Earth Elemental Myrmidons, as mentioned earlier, and then Jennifer tried to attune to the dungeon as a whole and all the standing stones once they got awakened, and they met the Wild Hunt, the druidic god, and he'd see they had their horn as well. So when they fought the Dragonbone Golem, they found the horn of the Sacred Grove at that point, and the Ring of Invisibility for the Rogue PC. The Wild Hunt the Master of the Wild Hunt basically said, is it you who's going to be the one who attunes to the horn and summons me? And Jennifer was a bit uncomfortable and said, no, that should probably be Sheila. And so he was like, bring Sheila here, and disappeared. So they then had to leave, get Sheila, go back. I think they did that the next day. And Sheila went with them. She attuned to the dungeon, or the stones, if you will, and the Master of the Wild Hunt appeared again and said, you're going to be the druid that does all this? And she says yes. And he says, prove yourself to me, and summons all the hounds, and summons I think it's like described as like a trident that does like lightning damage. I used the stat blocks from the Gothic Conversion for the hounds and the Master, and there was a fight, and it was quite cool actually. Sheila did quite a few natural 20s. For Sheila, I used the Archdruid stat block. I think that's essentially what's used in the Gothic Conversion anyway, like an amended Archdruid. And a chunk of his HP got knocked off, and so that it wasn't like action economy and just one enemy. The hounds were fighting the players and the other NPCs. And then after a few rounds, he says, you have proven yourself to me, and dismissed all the hounds and dismissed his weapon and said, use the horn to call for me when you need me, and I will come. You've proven yourself to me. And Sheila managed to convince it that Seamus, the brother-in-law cleric who was travelling around with them, because he was the sort of fated ally through Madame Ursula's card reading, she would be the one to summon the Wild Hunt through the Horn of the Sacred Grove, but she wanted him to be the carrier of the Sacred Grove so he gets all the benefits. Again, I should have mentioned this earlier, the Horn of the Sacred Grove, I used the sort of magic item benefits that are described in the Gothic Conversion, and it's an artifact, so it's got a few like major or minor properties in the Dungeon Master's Guide, which is quite interesting. Plus you can cast spells through it, plus I think it gives like fire resistance or maybe fire immunity, which is pretty cool. And that was that dungeon. But one of the random properties from the horn has like a Gaius, I think that's how it's pronounced, the magic spell where you're kind of like forced to do an activity, and if you don't do it you suffer the psychic damage. And it was essentially told by the Wild Hunt that in order to free himself from this, they needed to take care of the issue with the tower to the southwest, Ceithlenn's tower, as a matter of priority. So that was the place they went to next. As they left, there was a quick random encounter with some goblins and some wargs. This was their first time fighting the goblins, to give them a gauge of how tough they were. They then went to Ceithlenn's tower. So Ceithlenn has a very small amount of information, funny enough, in all places, in Curse of Strahd. For those of you who know Curse of Strahd, there are 3 night hags there who worship Ceithlenn of the Crooked Teeth, and there's a mini shrine by some megaliths near the windmill, which is their base. And because on this fan-made map it said it was Ceithlenn's tower, I can't remember if this was a suggestion in the Reddit post where I asked for advice, or I came up with this on my own idea, but I decided to have a hag coven, and not just a hag coven, but a mixed hag coven, because I'd already done night hags, and I know there's a few other hag variants. They'd already come across some Anis hags before, so I didn't use that. I used a green hag. Sorry, I'm just getting comfortable in my chair. A green hag from Monster Manual, and then there's a Boer hag and a dusk hag. I've forgotten to make a note in my notes of where they're from, bear with me. The Dust Hag is from Eberron, rising from the last war, and the Boer Hag is from, I can't remember the original one, but it's saying here Monsters of the Multiverse. It was probably either Mooncanon's Tome of Foes or Folo's Guide. And Boer Hags especially are pretty tough. So, and they were, and I used, there's alternative Hag Coven spells. I think they're in the monster manual, and one of them is like nature. So, because it's druids and nature, I gave them that Hag Coven spell list for a bit of flavour as well, which was really cool. On the way there, they encounter some dead goblins, some dead wargs, and they've all had their teeth removed. And I think it's to die with the whole crooked teeth ritual thing. I think they did similar sort of thing in Curse of Strahd, those hags. And the map, I struggled to find a good tower rooftop map I liked that matched the style of the one on the fan-made map, which almost looks a bit like the tower from Lord of the Rings, Saruman's tower, I can't remember the name of it, where it's kind of like, it's almost like pillar of dark rock and it's got spikes on the top. So I ended up making my own in Dungeon Draft. And I also made a ground-only version, because at one point they were talking about potentially luring the hags outside and fighting them outside, but in the end they decided to fight them on the rooftop. They fought the hags. It was quite an underwhelming battle in the end, because he took one of the hags out really quickly, so they didn't get much use of the Coven spells, but I did manage to get the Boer Hag to cast Cone of Cold, and they were like, oh god, that's a really tough spell, because that is a pretty brutal spell, even at higher level PCs. And yeah, they defeated them, and then Jennifer was able to attune to I had it that the spikes sticking out of the tower were the sort of the pillars of rock that you could attune to for purposes of a druid with a standing stone circle, and this gave her the ability to wild shape more times during between a short and long rest. So that was the sort of benefit she got from that. Next up was Aggie. So very happy to use Aggie. I couldn't not use Aggie. Aggie is classic Forlorn, Castle's Forlorn enemy. She's essentially the Loch Ness Monster in D&D world. Because they travelled in by ship that could teleport, but obviously they couldn't leave because the borders were closed, the druids kind of, when they explained this to the druids, they were like, oh yeah, Aggie's probably captured your ship now and wrapped its body around the ship or whatever. So they knew they'd have to deal with Aggie sooner or later in order to leave the domain in the future. And they decided to take her on, and they had access to the spell Windwalk, so they windwalked onto the ship. There's a ghost, I think they're called a Jolie, who looks after the sort of ship on their behalf, and she explained, yes, there's some monster nearby can sense it, and then Aggie raised out with the water, and there's some lightning eels as well, giant lightning eels I think they're called, that I had in the water just in case anyone fell in the water, they could attack. Aggie was then attacking the ship. I did take a screenshot at one point, I think, to share with the players, but as a sort of between sessions thing, because I think we ended the session mid-battle. And I think I put it on like one of the Ravenloft groups on Facebook, which was pretty cool. Made the token massive because I think it was gargantuan size. I can't remember stat block I used or if I made my own, but I think I used the one from the Gothic Conversion guide, which I think might be a reworked Sea Serpent from the Fizban's Treasury of Dragons book. And if I hadn't used that, I probably would have reworked the Fizban's book version anyway, so same difference. But instead of being a sea serpent, she's undead and her breath does poison damage. And she did huge poison breath damage attack straight away, nearly killed like 2 people. But then didn't re-roll, the recharge ability, I think get a 5 or a 6 to use it again, always rolled low. Did some big attacks on them, but she was defeated. But it was a good fun battle and the players loved it. They then decided to go to Castle Forfarmax. The ruins of Castle Forfarmax and Forfarmax Village, they were told could be, or at least the castle could be a fallback. If their sanctuary in the mines ever got compromised, they could go there. And during the Aggie battle, my player who uses Luba's Tarokka of Souls, I do a whole other video where I talk about Luba's Tarokka of Souls as a magic item. One of its side effects is it can release a monster, and they used it on Aggie, but it released the monster, and it was trapped somewhere. They didn't know where it went, but they knew it'd be somewhere in Forlorn because it couldn't escape Forlorn. Anyway, as they windwalked towards Castle Forfarmax, they see a group of goblins stood around the remains of an Alep. Or I imagine that when an Alep gets destroyed, it probably just disappears and disintegrates. It's quite a smoky, misty-looking creature. But anyway, I said its remains are on the ground, and so they go near these goblins to investigate what's going on. Now, previously I said that in my game, the goblins don't talk. So they were really surprised when one of them, who had a pristine wrong sword, who looked a bit more like a leader to the rest of them, was just like, what the heck was that? Why did that thing attack us? Oh, we lost a few good goblins to this thing. And this was heard ApKie. So they now finally encountered a goblin that could talk, and they were like, we should capture and interrogate the goblin, because a goblin that can talk could provide a lot of valuable information. Now, Herd in the original lore has 2 magic weapons, as well as I think it's a longsword of wounding, which I didn't use because I'd already had an NPC who had a katana of wounding. I think I chose a different, it might have been a vicious longsword, a different longsword magic item. He also had a dagger of warning, which alerts people if they're going to attack. So they were going to try and capture Herd, but Herd and his goblin straight away just turned around and were like, "We're under attack!" And they were gonna have a battle. The players called parley, and Herd was like, "Fine." You know, Herd had lost a few goblins to this Alep, and they were already on their way somewhere. Oh, I used this map from I think they're like a live play podcast called No Small Rolls, and they had this cool map of a ridge, and I had it the goblins, that's where the battle happened with the Alep. It's about a mile away from the castle, and they were looking at the castle, deciding what to do. And the reason they were heading to the castle is because there was this large black-winged creature who'd attack their camp, which was in the southeast, every now and again, and they were going to try and stop it. One of my players tries to explain to Herd the nature of the Domains of Dread, and I ended up creating this meme based on the Confused Woman meme, or Maths Woman, I can't remember what it's called, where he's just like, what are you talking about? And I shared it on the Ravenloft subreddit, and it was pretty popular. It's just facial expressions brilliant, as if to say, what are you on about? What? Domains of Dread, what? So he explains, fine, I'll tell you everything I know about the domain if you help us to fight this black-winged creature in the castle. And I asked for advice on Reddit once again, what kind of creature should I include? And somebody pointed me in the direction of a Nabasu. Nabasu's appeared in Modern Kingdoms Stone Foes, updated in Monsters of the Multiverse. They're pretty tough. They've got a challenge rating of 15, and they can create ghouls as minions as well. The map I used for the ruins was a Tom Kartos map. For those of you who know Tom Kartos, he's quite a well-known map maker in D&D circles. I had it that the upper floors are broken, and it's essentially just like a sort of ground floor areas where I put stuff. And I said that they could see like streaks of blood where maybe this Nabasu had caught some goblins, dragged them back to the lair, turned them into ghouls. And so they followed they didn't have to explore the whole castle. They could just follow the blood to know where they needed to go. And then they see 2 ghouls up top. The ghouls I flavoured as looking like they acted like ghouls, and they fought ghouls before a few times, but looked like goblins. So Herd was like, "Damn, these are my goblins. These are my part of my clan. How dare this thing do this to them?" And then they go underground and they see more ghouls and the Nabasu. Herd rolled really high on the initiative and charged straight into the room a bit chaotically, and he got downed and actually died. I give NPCs, or ally NPCs at least, 2 death saving throws instead of 3, and got killed. The Nabasu was pretty deadly, so the Nabasu got a huge hit or 2 on Herd, even though he has high HP. The Nabasu took out Erasmus van Richten, who's one of their allies. He's explained in Van Richten's guide as being a ghost. I use the poltergeist stat block. But ever since Valachan has kind of been following them around since Van Richten died, he sacrificed himself for the others to escape. Valachan, that's all explained in my Valachan video. But one big hit took out Erasmus. So they were like, no, Erasmus is dead, or dead in the sense of actually, gone, because he was already dead. He was a ghost / poltergeist. But I'm going to have it that he returns later. He's essentially just disappeared for a little while. The players did something that surprised me. They have access to the spell Revivify, and they had 3 diamonds left. And they used the 3 diamonds to revivify Herd. And I was going to say that the goblins with their leader dead were about to, because a few of the goblins came with them and a few went inside to help fight the ghouls and the Basu. The goblins were about to attack the PCs because they no longer had Herd guiding them and directing them, and then Herd's like, wait! And so they didn't attack. And Herd it's really hard playing like an evil character when, they do this mind-blowingly amazing gesture. And he was like, you brought me back to life. Like, I've never known anyone care about a goblin before. And so Herd, I had it, Herd, he's not necessarily turned good or anything, but he's blown away by this gesture. They would waste 3 diamonds and this powerful magic just to bring back a goblin. So he's like, I like you guys. And then he tells them all he knows. He knows that the Lord of the Land, whoever he or she may be, never leaves the castle. The castle contains ghosts, and assumes one of those is the Lord, but is not sure which one. And once in a while, every few months, there's a day where the goblins, including his goblins, but other goblins, all go funky, as if they're like lacking orders and confused. And this is the whole tie into the days that Tristan slumbers, the solstice and equinox days. Herd doesn't know why it happens, what the cause of it is. And the PCs, my players at the moment, don't know it's to do with equinoxes and solstices. And I did the D100 roll that Castle's Fallen recommends to see when the next solstice or equinox is, and I rolled a 7, very low on a D100. So upon arriving, the next equinox or solstice is 7 days time, and they've been blitzing through just a few days, all these mini quests in just a few days. So chances are that they'll do the whole castle and figure out what they got to do, and then go back a few days later in order to finish off Tristan for good. And thank goodness they don't have to stick around for 90 days or something silly. At that point, Herd and the surviving goblins leave, and says, if you ever need anything, come see me out at my camp. Oh, important detail as well is whenever he had important conversations about controlling the goblins and stuff like that, he always did it away from the goblins, because he said, I'm not sure if the goblins can telepathically, they're under somebody's control, probably the Lord of the Land. I'm not sure if they can telepathically explain stuff back. So he tried to be very secretive and tell them stuff away from other goblins. He'd be like, go stand over there and guard. The Dueling Tower. So I had a great suggestion here from Reddit about using Rodjan Dilisnya. So Dilisnya is the name that comes up a few times in Ravenloft. There's the Dilisnya family in Borka, and I believe one of the two Dark Lords is a Dilisnya. Ivan Dilisnya, I want to say. And for those of you who know Strahd lore and Barovia lore, there was Leo Dilisnya, the guard / soldier / assassin, who tries to kill Strahd on his wedding day, but ends up helping him trigger his vampire ability. This is all old lore stuff. I think in 5th edition, he's just literally a box of bones in the walk to the house, which is just kind of like a general nod to him. But Rodjan Dilisnya is this basically blackguard paladin. And I just had the idea that he's there. Well, I didn't have the idea, sorry. Reddit gave me the idea. But then in terms of him being there, I was like, okay, so he's just there. Why is he there? What's going on? And then I had a brainwave, literally the session just before they went there, of how to tie it to my characters. So my paladin, who I mentioned, the adopted daughter, etc., he started taking warlock classes at one point, and I needed to come up with a patron. And I decided on Ebonbane, because he's a Hexblade warlock, and Hexblade warlocks have sentient weapons as their patrons. And Ebonbane is one of the 3 Dark Lords in the Shadowlands, and is essentially a sentient sword. Although actually I think it's like a demon, but anyway. And I had Rodjan there, they climbed the tower. Oh, for the map I used the House of Thalivar map from Stormlord's Wrath again, which I talked about earlier. That's where I got a stat block for a monster. I used that map for the tower, which has some like empty library rooms. I'll get to that in a minute. And when they arrived, they tried to go up very stealthily and disguised. Some went invisible. I think one person disguised themselves as a goblin, so that you just think, oh, it's a goblin. I don't mind goblins. But he revealed that he was waiting for somebody. And the person he was waiting for was my Air Genasi Paladin Warlock PC. And the reason he was waiting for them is he wanted to challenge them to a duel, because their fellow patron, he was the patron's favourite, and then the PC came along and was no longer the favourite, and the patron said, if you want any chance of being my favourite again, you've got to go to Forlorn, go to this tower and wait for the PC to arrive and challenge them to a fight. And so it wasn't a one-sided fight with just this Rodjan Dilisnya on his own fighting, either just the paladin or multiple PCs, NPCs. I had him summon Phantom Warriors, but I used the wrong token. I used the Sword Wraith Warrior tokens, but I used the Phantom Warrior stat blocks. They're very similar. Phantom Warriors, I think, were a Curse of Strahd specific monster. The Sword Wraith Warriors are from Monsters in the Multiverse and whatever book they came from before that. They got the same AC, same HP, similar attacks, so it wasn't too much of a divergence. But I like the Phantom Warrior stat blocks and wanted to use them, any excuse to use them again. I also have a PC who's a Were-Raven, so he's immune to non-magical damage, and I think with the Sword Wraith Warriors it's slashing damage, but with the Phantom Warriors it's force damage, so all the more reason to use the Phantom Warriors. For Rodjan, I used I think it was the Warlord stat block from Monsters of the Multiverse again. I like to use a lot from that book or the 2 books that preceded it. And I gave him a magical longsword, a magical shield, demon armor, which is pretty cool. And he got disarmed with a sword at one point and made his hand, the gauntlet's claws, which is part of its thing. And for flavor, he had a dread helm, which I think is a common magic item. All it does is it's a cool thing. You put it on your head, it makes your face look shadowy and your eyes shine red. It has no actual mechanical benefit. It's just all purely aesthetic and cosmetic. And I gave him that as well to make him look cool. And they defeated him, and he mentioned Ebonbane as he was dying, and he fell off the tower. Dramatic sort of fall back. And then they don't previously explored the tower. On the maps, it has like library rooms, and I decided that these were empty library rooms that had empty books. All the books have been taken away, and the story is that it was all Forfar and druid knowledge that basically Tristan learnt about and sent goblins there over a long period of time to send them back to Castle Tristenoira. So I'll say that if they find either the library or some of the study rooms in Castle Tristenoira, they'll find those books. Okay, and then everything else at that point was essentially preparing to storm the castle. They went back to the mine. They had the second part of the Tarokka reading from Madame Ursula that told them of the locations of the sword, the letter, and Tristan within the castle, except it wasn't Tristan. Tristan got named, and what I wanted to do was I didn't want them knowing that Tristan was obviously the Dark Lord. I want them to... Tristan, when they met Tristan, was going to say, she's the Dark Lord, pointing to Rule, the druid ghost, his adopted mother. And so I think in the card reading text it says, this will lead you to him, and they changed it to this will lead you to them. So they don't know if it's a man or a woman they're looking for. So hopefully Tristan will say, Rule's the one you need to kill, she's the real Dark Lord, or something to that effect. He probably wouldn't know what a Dark Lord is and use that terminology, but you get what I mean. I kept the location guide for the sword and the letter. So there's in Castles Forlorn, I think there's only, it's DM's choice. The sword can be in one of 4 locations, and in the conversion guide they do the same. And originally I liked the idea of, let me do like 10 cards and 10 different locations. But in the end I tried to tie what the card's meaning was to the same 4 locations, and then had different cards for the letter, the love letter, and then I had about 10 cards for Tristan's location, which I added a few additional places to that. I'll cut to the video again because one of my players couldn't make it. I recorded it for her benefit, and I'm going to cut to that.
That concludes the card reading. So I'll do it again. Executioner. Card tells of a song of sorrow. The sword that killed the sun will be found in this place. And the card was Druid. The clue was a place of learning, the room of many nights and days spent researching. Here the monster hides their guilt from their own eyes. The second card, Innocent. Innocent love corrupted by fate. This card leads to the place where are kept the words at the beginning of everything. Many answers lay there. You got Priest. A place of care and love it should have been. It keeps the proof of past emotions. But even love may wither and die, suffocated by the sorrow. And lastly, Dark Lord. Your enemy is a creature suspended on the edge between dusk and dawn. This card will lead you to them. A chamber where the Dark Lord confers with an audience. You may encounter a trade of goods here, treasure in return for a life. However, the Dark Lord has other plans.
Part of their plan, they were going to get Herd to meet them. So they went to Herd and said that meet us by the Dueling Tower, which is about a mile away from Castle Tristenoira, tomorrow at noon. Bring your clan, and because of his life being saved and they helped in the Basu, despite Herd being evil and probably having his own plans and goals, he was happy with that. Because they did say overall, like even in Castles Forlorn, that his main goal is he wants to basically free his goblins of whatever curse is on them and take over the land and make it his own. So of course he's going to help the PC storm the castle and defeat the Dark Lord. And the plan was that the Herd and some of the druids, including Sheila, were going to cause a distraction so that the PCs could storm the castle, draw most of the goblins out, away from the castle and Burnham. Burnham was mentioned, but they didn't have any reason to go to Burnham. So no, didn't run Burnham, didn't run Death's Head Tree, sadly. But they needed a plan to lure the goblins away from Castle Tristenoira so that when they went to the castle, it was a lot quieter. So in addition to Herd's clan and some druids, Sheila summoned the Wild Hunt. And they drew hundreds of goblins away from the castle, and the Wild Hunt just obliterated them with the Master of the Wild Hunt and his hounds. And at that point, both Herd and Sheila were like, go to the castle now, we've got this covered, that kind of classic thing in the movies. And then the PCs took a sort of longer way around the castle to go to the castle and defeat them. That was the plan anyway, and that's essentially what happened. Looking at my notes, I forgot to mention as well, before they went, in addition to the card reading, they had from the second part of the card reading from Madame Ursula, I had the druids retell the story. That was the story they had upon their arrival. I figured it'd be useful to hear the names Bard at blank, Mark at blank before, and I think Drool might get mentioned. Get their names mentioned, and the whole thing about a druid who raised the person died and all the tragedies, or the family died and the tragedies of the at blanks. Have that fresh in their minds just before they go to the castle. And I rediscovered as well that there's a song called Lament of the Dead, which I think there's an NPC in Castles Forlorn called Svendar who sings it, and it says if Svendar doesn't get a chance to sing it, one of the druids could sing it. And I had them sing this song, and it's essentially Rivelin and Flora's story about how they were lovers and rulers of Forlorn, or Forfar, I guess, and that he becomes a vampire and that kind of thing. So it gives a hint that there's sort of vampire as well as ghost activity at the Castle Tristenoira. And that's it. They arrived at the castle. So far as I record this, they've spent a bit of time wandering the castle. I've done a few rolls of the dice, the temporal shifts, the time shifts, and it keeps rolling Castle C. So they're mostly exploring it, where it's all in ruins and the time of the goblins. But there was one time they walked into a room and I described it as being a bit more in better shape, and that was Castle B, but then they triggered another Castle C temporal shift again. It's just like, ugh. If it gets to the point where they just keep rolling, every time I roll it to C, I'll just make it a Castle A or Castle B, because it's much more interesting as soon as they figure out, oh, okay, and see these people who are completely oblivious, what's a goblin, and what are you talking about, other parts of the castle and stuff like that. So very excited for when they discover the true nature of the castle and its time travel shenanigans. And that's it for this video. Probably a bit longer than I expected it would be, and I'm glad I've split it into 2 parts, but hopefully that's useful for you if you're thinking of running Forlorn, and especially if you're thinking of using the map I used or doing different to Castles Forlorn or wanting to put your own spin on it. So part 2 is going to be a video coming up. Once I've run all of Castle Tristenoira and finished up Forlorn, I'll do a castle video talking about how I ran it, what happened when they were there and stuff like that. I'm going to run it pretty much straight out of Castles Forlorn, even using their maps, and talk about how I did that using Roll20. It was not easy and it took hours and days of prep, but it's sorted now, and you know, this is going to probably take us through a couple of months out of game, so it's worth it in the long run. Another video I want to do Ravenloft is good NPCs to introduce in a Ravenloft campaign from older lore. So I recently did a villains version where I said, oh, villains you can introduce. And then this good NPCs one will be people from older Ravenloft novels and lore that aren't mentioned necessarily in 5th edition, in Van Richten's Guide or whatever. And we'll wrap up there. Thank you, Mr. Wanderers.